July 1943. The Tunisian sun was not a giver of life, but a hammer. It beat down upon the cracked earth, upon the thorned, skeletal remains of bushes, and upon the slumped shoulders of the men of the Regio Esercito. They were a river of defeated men, flowing not towards an ocean of glory, as the Duce's posters had promised, but into the stagnant reservoir of captivity. Their uniforms, once a source of pride, were now little more than sun-bleached rags, sweat-stiffened and stained with the rust-coloured dust of a continent that had devoured their ambitions. Among them was Sergeant Major Alessandro Gallo, a man whose face was a roadmap of forgotten campaigns, each line a trench dug by hardship, each crease a testament to a victory that now tasted like ash in his mouth. He, like the others, had been forged in the crucible of fascist ideology, a belief system that told them they were the inheritors of Rome, a people of superior spirit, hardness, and sacrifice. They were taught that their enemies, particularly the Americans, were a mongrel race of capitalists and jazz-addled consumers, soft and decadent, their power derived not from inner strength, but from a crude and soulless machine. They expected their captors to be either brutal thugs, mirroring their own hardened doctrines, or incompetent fools, confirming their decadent nature. They were prepared for cruelty or chaos. They were prepared for anything but the silent, terrifying competence that awaited them. Their march ended at the edge of what seemed to be a mirage, a hallucination born of heat and dehydration. On a flat expanse of desert that had been empty scrubland only hours before, a sprawling city of stark, white tents now stood, arranged in perfect, unnerving geometric precision under the oppressive blue sky. Red crosses, vibrant and impossibly clean, were emblazoned on their roofs. There was no shouting, no disorder, no sense of the frantic improvisation that defined their own field aid stations. Instead, there was a low, steady hum, the sound of generators. Men in clean khaki uniforms moved with a purpose that was both relaxed and efficient, their motions economical and sure. The captured Italians stared, their cynicism a shield against the sight. Gallo spat a dry flake of dust onto the ground. A propaganda display, he thought. A Potemkin village erected for the benefit of journalists or perhaps to break their spirit with a show of false opulence. It was a trick, a flimsy facade designed to mask the enemy's inherent weakness. They would be herded past it, perhaps photographed, and then marched to a squalid pen of barbed wire where reality would reassert itself. They had seen such tricks before. War was a theatre of lies, and this was merely another set piece on a vast and brutal stage. The initial shock was not in the existence of the place, but in its function. They were not marched past it, they were marched into it. A line was formed, not with the butt of a rifle or a snarled command, but with a quiet gesture from a young American medic whose face was devoid of malice. The wounded were separated from the walking, a process of triage so swift and methodical it seemed rehearsed 1,000 times. Gallo, his arm throbbing from a shrapnel wound that had been crudely bandaged a week ago, found himself being gently guided towards a tent with a sign he couldn't read, but whose purpose was unmistakable. He saw his comrades, men he had seen left to die for lesser wounds in their own lines, being laid on actual cots with clean, white sheets. The air inside the tent didn't smell of gangrene and despair, the signature perfume of every Italian field hospital he had ever known. It smelled of antiseptic, a clean, sharp, chemical smell that was as alien in this desert as a field of spring flowers. He braced himself for the inevitable brutality, for the cursory, contemptuous treatment of a prisoner. Instead, a nurse, a woman whose calm blue eyes met his without a flicker of hatred, began to carefully cut away his filthy bandage with shining steel scissors. This couldn't be real. The entire edifice had to be a fragile illusion, a temporary extravagance that would crumble under the slightest pressure. If you are captivated by the psychological clash of worlds, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the untold stories of history. It was not a single, isolated spectacle. That was the second, more profound shock, the one that began to systematically dismantle the architecture of their beliefs. The next day, from their holding area, they watched a convoy of large, olive-drab trucks arrive at another empty patch of desert a few kilometers away. With the coordinated efficiency of a beehive, teams of men from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers swarmed out. Prefabricated wooden floor sections were laid down upon the sand. Massive canvas tents were unfurled and raised on metal poles, pulled taut by ropes hammered into the ground with a rhythmic, percussive beat. Within 2 hours, the basic structures were in place. Then came the other trucks. One disgorged a generator, which was connected by a spiderweb of thick black cables, and soon the same low, industrious hum filled the air. Another truck unfolded into a fully equipped surgical theatre, its stainless steel surfaces glinting in the sun. Another was a water purification unit. Another, a kitchen. By late afternoon, a second, fully functional mobile field hospital, a 400-bed evacuation hospital they would later learn, had materialized from nothing. It was not a miracle, it was a process. It was industry. The Italians watched this act of creation with a growing sense of dread. This wasn't for show. This was logistics. This was a system, a replicable, scalable model of terrifying power. They saw wounded men, both American and Axis, being flown in on transport planes that landed on a hastily graded airstrip nearby. They saw supplies being unloaded with a casual abundance that bordered on the obscene. Crates of plasma, boxes of sulfur drugs, mountains of bandages, endless rolls of sterile gauze. They remembered their own medical officers hoarding single vials of morphine, remembered operations performed with unsterilized instruments and a prayer, remembered men dying of simple infections because there was no medicine. Here, medicine was not a precious commodity. It was an industrial product distributed with the same impersonal efficiency as bullets or fuel. This realization was a slow-acting poison. The initial disbelief curdled into a disquieting awe, and then into something far colder and heavier. It was the dawning, terrifying understanding that they were not fighting a nation of shopkeepers. They were fighting a factory. The propaganda had spoken of American decadence, of a society so obsessed with comfort that it had grown soft and weak. Yet here was the physical manifestation of that decadence, and it was not soft, it was overwhelming. It was a weapon more potent than any tank or artillery piece, for it targeted the very foundations of their will to fight. A young private from Naples, no older than 19, a boy raised on slogans of glory and sacrifice, watched as an American dentist, working in a dedicated tent with a portable X-ray machine, treated a German prisoner's abscessed tooth. The German, who had been moaning in agony for days, was given anesthesia before the procedure. The Neapolitan boy thought of his own brother, who had lost a leg to a gangrenous wound that could have been prevented with a single dose of the right medicine. The fascist ideal glorified suffering. It was a sign of a man's strength, his willingness to endure for the state. But the Americans seemed to possess a bizarre, almost fanatical obsession with eliminating it. Their entire system was geared towards preservation, recovery, and the mitigation of pain, even for their enemies. It was a form of warfare so alien it defied their comprehension, a battle fought not with hate, but with an inexhaustible supply of sterile cotton and clean water. Has a story ever made you question the very nature of power? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like this video to help us explore more such narratives. The cognitive dissonance this created was a grinding, abrasive force in the minds of the captured men. It was a direct, irrefutable contradiction of everything they had been taught. Sergeant Major Gallo lay on his cot, his cleaned and stitched wound now healing under a pristine white bandage. He had been given a shot for the pain and another to prevent infection. He felt the dull, steady throb in his arm, but it was nothing compared to the throbbing in his mind. He was a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, of Abyssinia, of the Greek campaign. He had seen the true face of modern warfare as his nation practiced it, a desperate, make-do struggle characterized by chronic shortages, antiquated equipment, and a callous disregard for the individual soldier who was expected to give his life willingly, a small cog in a grand, glorious machine. He remembered the Battle of Guadalajara, where the wounded froze to death in the snow for lack of blankets. He remembered the North African campaign, where a man's life was worth less than the water in his canteen. Their system ran on spirito, on rhetoric, on the promise of a revived Roman Empire. It ran on anything but resources, because resources were what they lacked. He looked around the ward. Americans, Germans, Italians, all lay in identical beds receiving identical care. A nurse checked the chart at the foot of his bed, gave him a brief professional smile, and moved on to the German in the next cot. There was no gloating, no contempt, only a detached, clinical concern. This, he realized, was the most humiliating part. They were not even worthy of his captor's hatred. They were simply problems to be solved, broken components to be fixed or discarded with the same dispassionate logic one would apply to a malfunctioning engine. He and his men had been conditioned to see the world as a grand, romantic struggle between virile, passionate ideologies and weak, materialistic ones. But what he was witnessing was not an ideological victory. It was a logistical one. The Americans weren't winning because their ideals were stronger. They were winning because they could build a hospital in an afternoon. They could conjure order out of chaos, cleanliness out of filth, and life out of the jaws of death, and they could do it on an industrial scale. It was a power that had nothing to do with fighting spirit or national destiny. It was the power of planning, of production, of immense, bottomless wealth. Corporal Lorenzo de Luca, a quiet farmer from Sicily who had been conscripted a year prior, experienced the shock on a more elemental level. He was not an ideologue like the young private, nor a hardened cynic like Gallo. He was a practical man, a man who understood the earth, the seasons, the fundamental calculus of input and output. Back home, his family reused every scrap of cloth, preserved every last vegetable, and guarded their meager resources with a fierce desperation. Waste was a sin. Here he saw waste on a scale that staggered him. He watched a medic use a half-dozen large swabs of alcohol to clean a small cut on a prisoner's hand, then discard them into a bin. He saw men being given 3 hot meals a day, served on metal trays with portions that seemed impossibly generous. He saw clean water used for washing, for laundry, for hosing down the wooden floors of the tents. It was a profligacy that felt almost supernatural. He tried to calculate the resources required to sustain just this one hospital for a single day. The fuel for the generators, the medicine, the food, the water, the manpower. Then he tried to imagine hundreds of such hospitals spread across every front of the war, and his mind simply failed. It was a power that didn't need to shout. It didn't need grand speeches or waving flags. Its existence was its own statement, a quiet, overwhelming declaration of supremacy that rendered all their propaganda, all their sacrifices, utterly and pathetically meaningless. This story reveals how the mundane can be more powerful than the monumental. If you agree, hit the like button and share this video with someone who appreciates nuanced history. The psychological impact deepened with each passing day. The men's initial suspicion gave way to a grudging, resentful admiration. They began to compare. The comparisons were brutal, a form of self-flagellation that stripped away the last vestiges of their martial pride. They compared the American medics with their calm, methodical training to their own frantic, overworked doctors who often had more in common with butchers than healers. They compared the American nurses, symbols of a nation so rich it could afford to send its women to the front lines, simply to provide comfort and care, to the absence of any such figures in their own army. The presence of these women was perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. It suggested a society so secure, so confident in its power, that it could shield them from the worst horrors of the conflict, preserving a pocket of gentle civilization in the heart of the inferno. It was a luxury they could not even conceive of. Their own women were needed in the factories and the fields, their lives consumed by the desperate struggle for national survival. The American women were here, a living testament to a surplus of everything, of people, of resources, of compassion. This constant, silent comparison eroded their sense of self. What did their famed Italian spirito matter when faced with penicillin? What was the value of their willingness to endure hardship when the enemy had simply engineered hardship out of existence? They began to feel not like proud warriors of a rising empire, but like primitives from some forgotten, impoverished land, encountering a civilization so advanced it operated on principles they could not grasp. It was a profound and deep-seated humiliation, one that went far beyond the simple fact of military defeat. It was a cultural and technological defeat, a verdict delivered not by a tribunal of generals, but by the quiet efficiency of a sterile ward. They had been taught to despise the Americans for their softness, but they were now the beneficiaries of that softness, and it was saving their lives. They had been taught to mock the Americans for their reliance on machines, but those machines were now humming softly in the desert night, powering the lights that allowed a surgeon to meticulously piece together a man's shattered leg. The very foundations of their identity were cracking. They were the heirs of Rome, yet they were being cared for like children by the descendants of colonists and immigrants. They were the proponents of a harsh, virile new order, yet they were being undone by a system that seemed to run on kindness. It was an inversion of their entire universe. The young private from Naples, the true believer, suffered the most. He lay awake at night listening to the hum of the generator, and it sounded to him like the laughter of a god he had never known existed. He tried to cling to the old hatreds, to the familiar slogans, but they felt hollow and absurd in this place. How could you hate an enemy who healed you? How could you believe in your own superiority when the evidence of your inferiority was all around you, in the cleanliness of the sheets, the potency of the medicine, and the quiet, unassailable confidence of your captors? He felt a profound sense of betrayal, though he couldn't say by whom. Was it the Duce for lying to them? Or was it reality itself for not conforming to the glorious narrative they had been promised? The world they knew was a lie. The future they had been fighting for was a fantasy. All that was left was the quiet, antiseptic reality of the tent and the crushing weight of an enemy's incomprehensible strength. The subtle details often tell the most powerful stories. If you want more content that looks beyond the battles and into the hearts of those who fought, make sure you're subscribed. The climax of this psychological unraveling was not a single, dramatic event, but a slow, creeping epiphany that crystallized around a simple object, a can of peaches. Lorenzo De Luca, the Sicilian farmer, was recovering from a bout of dysentery, rehydrated and nursed back to health in a way that would have been impossible just weeks earlier. One afternoon, with his meal, he was given a small metal can. He opened it to find perfect golden peach halves suspended in a thick, sweet syrup. He ate one, and the taste was a revelation, a sweetness so pure, so untainted by hardship, it felt like a memory from another life, from a world before the war. He knew what it took to grow peaches, to harvest them, to preserve them. He knew the labor, the sun, the soil, the sugar, all precious commodities in his world. Here they were casual handouts dispensed to prisoners of war in the middle of a desert thousands of miles from where they were grown. In that moment, the mobile hospital ceased to be just a building or a collection of medical equipment in his mind. It became a symbol. It was a symbol of a power so vast and so profound that it could pluck a piece of summer from a distant orchard, seal it in a can, and transport it across an ocean to be given to a defeated enemy. It was a symbol of a system that could not only wage a global war, but could do so while still providing such small, perfect luxuries. The hospital, with its generators, its X-ray machines, its stores of plasma and its cans of peaches, was the end point of a colossal logistical chain that stretched back across the Atlantic to the farms and factories of a continent humming with productivity. It was a power that did not need to boast, for its capabilities were self-evident. It was the power to create, to sustain, to heal, and to do it all with an ease that suggested its resources were practically infinite. This was not a war of soldiers against soldiers or ideologies against ideologies. It was a war of a pre-industrial agrarian society fueled by rhetoric and passion against a fully realized industrial superpower fueled by oil, steel, and an assembly line that produced not just tanks and planes, but hope in a can. Gallo saw it too, though for him the symbol was different. He watched a young American doctor, a man who looked like he should be in a university classroom, spend 2 hours meticulously setting the shattered bones in the arm of a German corporal. The doctor worked with an intense, focused patience, treating the enemy limb as if it were the most important thing in the world. Gallo knew that in his own army the arm would have been amputated at the shoulder inside of 10 minutes. It was the efficient, practical thing to do. But the Americans were not being practical, they were being something else. They were being human. They were expending immense resources, time and skill to save the arm of a man who, a week ago, was trying to kill them. This act, so contrary to the brutal logic of total war, was the ultimate display of power. It was the power of a civilization so confident in its ultimate victory that it could afford to be merciful. It could afford to see the enemy not as a political abstraction to be annihilated, but as a broken man to be mended. The war was already over. They had lost it long before the first shot was fired. They had lost it in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the factories of Detroit, and the quiet, efficient laboratories where things like penicillin were being invented. The greatest symbols of power are often the most unexpected. Click the bell icon so you don't miss our next exploration of the hidden symbols that shaped history. The long-term legacy of this encounter was etched not in history books, but in the memories of the men who survived it. When the war ended and they were finally repatriated to a shattered, defeated Italy, they brought this memory with them. It was a difficult story to tell. How could they explain to their families, who had endured years of rationing and deprivation, that they had been healed by an enemy who had seemed to possess everything in abundance? How could they describe the psychological shock of encountering a system so overwhelmingly competent, so terrifyingly humane? Most of them didn't. It remained a private, formative experience, a secret touchstone of truth in a world that had been built on lies. The memory of the white tents in the desert became the silent, irrefutable proof that their cause had been doomed from the start. Alessandro Gallo returned to his small village in the Abruzzo mountains. He never spoke of his medals or the battles he had fought. He became a quiet man, known for his cynical view of politicians and their grand promises. But sometimes when his grandson would ask him about the war, he would not speak of combat or glory. He would describe a city made of white canvas that grew out of the sand in a single afternoon. He would describe the smell of antiseptic and the hum of a generator that ran all night, holding the darkness at bay. He would describe the taste of canned peaches. And in the telling, his grandson would not see a defeated soldier, but a man who had witnessed a profound and world-altering truth. He had seen the future, and it belonged to the people who could build a hospital faster than his own nation could build a bunker. The young private from Naples, the boy whose faith in fascism had been shattered, spent the rest of his life grappling with the implications of what he had seen. He rejected all forms of political extremism, having witnessed firsthand how hollow ideology was in the face of true systemic power. He became a teacher, and he tried to instill in his students a respect for practical things, for science, for logistics, for the quiet, unglamorous work of building a better, more humane world. The American mobile hospital had not just healed his body, it had deprogrammed his mind. It had replaced a doctrine of glorious death with a lesson in the complex, difficult business of preserving life. It was a lesson he never forgot. The hospital was a weapon that had defeated him without ever firing a shot. It had conquered him with competence, disarmed him with compassion, and ultimately it had set him free. The greatest victories are not won on the battlefield, but in the minds of the vanquished. The white tents were long ago struck from the desert sands, but their legacy endured in the lives of the men who saw them, a stark and enduring monument to a time when they, the proud heirs of Rome, came face to face with the quiet, inexorable power of a factory that had mastered the art of mending its enemies. What historical event completely changed your perspective on the world? Share your story in the comments below. Thank you for watching.